Thank you. And can I invite the panelists to come up here at the table while we take some questions, and I like the phrase conversation from the room. These issues of going from data to interpretation and understanding and then action are all really important issues, and the role of politics in this, which so often we sidestep the question of whether and how politics plays a role in this. So let me, without further ado, yes, Big Mac, can you give him a mic? And please, when you are called on, wait for the mic because we have online participants.
My question to the panel, but also to Stuti, that how does this interface of providing information through media and citizen action to improve service delivery operate in the context of democratic backtracking? Because this is the process which is being referred to by Raymond as well, that since 2000 there is a closing off of the civil society space, and many new democracy hope has been proved to be to the contrary by the end of the decade of 2000s. So whether this model is very workable in the context of a functioning democracy and make it more functional from the point of SDG, whether the same model would work in the context of mixed sort of democracy or democratic backtracking. That would be my generic question.
Let's go ahead and take 3 questions, I think, first. So there, and then back there.
Thank you. Mark Robinson, World Resources Institute. Many thanks indeed for the presentations and discussants. I wonder if we can encourage you to make the leap to address the so what for SDG implementation of the perspectives you shared with us. In particular, we're now at the stage of, we have the 16 goals, the multiple targets. We even have a specific goal 16, which speaks to many of the issues you both raised. But looking at more broadly at the full set of the SDGs, the 15-year time frame, what salient political issues would you both highlight as being most significant for successful implementation? Is it to do with building broad-based political support in countries, which is probably not there for the most part? Is it building more effective accountability systems around the goals themselves and mass public dissemination of information and civic engagement? Or is it perhaps to do with simply strengthening capacity for implementation at different levels of government? So what are the most salient political factors you'd both pick out in relation to the perspectives you shared with us? Thank you.
Thank you. And one more on the back there.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Michael Davidson. I'm an independent agricultural consultant in climate smart agriculture working primarily in East Africa. My question has to do with your rights-based approach. I'm wondering if there isn't perhaps a little moral hazard involved here, because in the developing world, of course, economic rights are still very much unattainable and certainly not in the mainstream system. And I'm wondering, we know that needs-based approaches have all kinds of inherent problems, but what we're finding that is successful in an almost anecdotal way in various parts of East Africa are asset-based approaches. And I'm wondering if you've ever looked at that, seem to be a little more attainable, and we've had success with that. Thank you.
Okay, that gives us, do you want to go ahead and respond to these, and then we'll get a couple more questions. Stuti, do you want to go first?
So thanks very much to the panel and the audience for the questions. I really learnt a lot from Ray's presentation, and I'm very grateful to Theodaj and Katrina for raising such thoughtful issues. So very quickly for each of them, and then the three other questions that were raised. One, the big thing that I took away from Ray's presentation was this dominant narrative among international actors that you witnessed, that business as usual is not acceptable. It seems as though we are at a moment in time where external actors who intervene to try to make a difference in poor and developing countries are really coming to grips with their own limitations. And I think we would, and certainly we've done this in blog posts we've done about the report, sort of gone beyond the report, taken the leap that Mark is talking about, and described how it really shifts the paradigm from one where all the answers reside among technical experts outside countries, and that somehow needs to be transferred, and people have to be educated, and their behaviors have to be changed in developing countries. I mean, in this report, we are really documenting homegrown processes of change. So I'll just quickly segue into Mark's question on this and respond to it by referring to a paper that Shanta Devarajan and I did. It's out in the working paper series at the bank, so you can sort of Google our names and you'll find it, or send me an email. And it was prepared at the invitation of the International Economic Association for its a conference volume on governance, where they had brought together some leading thinkers on governance at Montevideo. And we make the case for one, the main thing that's needed for the SDGs is a resource transfer. Development is fundamentally about lack of resources, and so a redistributive resource transfer from the rich countries to the poor countries is obviously a minimal that's needed. Resources are required to attain those goals. And what Shanta and I argue is that resource transfer should be made as less taxing as possible on poor country governments, but without being naive or overlooking the fact that a lot of the people in power in poor country governments suffer from the government failure problem that this research is about. And so we have a proposal for how do you use the messages from research to address those government failures while at the same time efficiently transferring the resources. The main point from Theodaj's thoughtful comments that I'd like to address is the one of whether decentralization, local versus national, is an empirical question. Completely agree. The argument here was in fact not about local versus national as much as finding space wherever citizens are actively politically engaged. And the examples were drawn purposefully to showcase places where the national space is closed, or such as the Ugandas or the Chinas of the world, but where the national, and I think I'm completely agree with some of the points you raised, and I think came up in Katrina's comments as well, where in fact you might find allies at the national level who can use these ideas to improve service delivery at the last mile by holding local agents accountable. So it's really not a contrast between centralization versus decentralization as much as how do you use reform leaders at different levels and work with them to apply the lessons of the report. For Katrina, I would pick the thought on, are we being too pessimistic about non-political citizen engagement? So one of the things that I hope you will take away from the report, although I do think it's a complex idea, is that picture of the three triangles that I had in there. So the middle triangle, middle and the third triangle, is really the complex business of government. How do bureaucrats, service providers, all of these multiple agents within government work with each other? And that's where the problem of who has what specialized information about what are the right things to do, what are my agents in the field doing, all of these issues that Katrina raised. And what we do is we make a distinction between the role of information and citizen engagement within those triangles, which we call the within government principal agent problems. And we show how solving those problems depends upon the overall political environment. So whether governments are going to do the technically right thing about giving information to the actors within the government that need it, and whether they're going to design the right institutions for effective non-political citizen engagement really depends upon their political incentives. So we provide a lot of examples in the paper, about, there's a paper by Abhijit Banerjee and others in India called Putting Band-Aid on a Corpse, which is about how an effective technological intervention to improve health service delivery was sabotaged by the nurses, and they describe the political environment which facilitated that. For Binayak's question, and I would like to link it back to Ray's description of the closing of civil society space. I think we go to great lengths in the report to say that our approach, and Katrina was summarizing it very nicely, and Theodaj, and in fact I forget which one, about how we are focusing on changes within countries over time, is really important because it sidesteps the question you asked, Vinayak. So I don't think we are we are not saying that information or political engagement is only effective when you have strong institutions in place. In fact, we are saying that when you begin with weak institutions, to get to strong institutions requires endogenous changes in political behavior, and that the current context of the world of these forces of political engagement and transparency, things are happening which are, as Katrina was saying, endogenous, the chicken and the egg problem. They are endogenous and circular in many ways, but how do we move forward harnessing these energies? So I think I'll stop there because I've already talked a lot. Thank you.
Great.
Well, maybe what I might try to do is actually answer the first question. The question was asked about what's the most salient set of political actions that we need to be taking in order to address the SDGs, and use that as kind of a platform from which to kind of answer some of the other questions, Binayak's as well as from my fellow panelists. I actually think there are three things maybe we need to be thinking about. One is this continuing what I guess we might call the transparency revolution, and transparency/accountability revolution that's underway now in kind of building tools, and I think there's two dimensions of that, though: building the tools and enabling groups to use them, as well as protecting that civil society space as best we can. And there's lots of battles going on in countries all over the world today to resist some of this legislation that's going through, or water it down, or challenge it. And I think that's work that has to continue. And I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and suggest we may end up over the next decade in a situation where that's kind of somewhat repetitive of the 80s, when a lot of us who were working in the human rights field were working on these issues in kind of a solidarity mode, in which groups at the national level were under significant pressure from in terms of civil and political space and human rights, around human rights issues, and they depended a lot on solidarity with groups at the international level to actually provide protections, defense, and pressure on governments, using diplomatic means, pressure on their own governments to actually to enable that space to stay open. We may be entering another phase like that, in which the relationship between global and national institutions is really going to matter if we're going to preserve that political space. So I think that's a larger political project that's not on the SDG agenda, but it may evolve in that direction. The second thing I think is important actually is our institutions, and Stuti's emphasized this strongly. I would emphasize both public sector institutions that are responsive in some ways to the kind of political pressure you're talking about, but also the private or not-for-profit sector institutions. And I want to really emphasize that one of the things that's happening that's not all that visible to most people when in these kinds of conversations when you're talking about this is there's a whole new generation of institutional players out there with competencies that we've never seen before. For example, there's a global, at the Ford Foundation 25 years ago, we started funding an international budget monitoring project, We funded 2 countries, Bangladesh and the Philippines. There are now 200 organizations globally in literally, which is a global movement on budget monitoring. And they're very sophisticated, and some of them are doing it at the state level. And it was all started by a colleague at the World Bank from India, in southern India, and around Bangalore, at literally a subnational level doing scorecards. And then it sort of spread into kind of a budget process on a global level. There's other groups that are looking at tax questions. There's networks working on taxation questions. And I think what we need to be looking at is what's this new generation of organizations looking like at the national level that are doing things that we take for granted here in the United States and in Western Europe, that are doing them actually in countries where we never would have imagined them before. And I think the political project is making sure we're supporting those organizations, most of which were supported by international foundations like Ford and Rockefeller and others in the past, but are by and large invisible and not necessarily achieving or receiving the support they probably need to sustain themselves. So that's a second body of work. And I think the last one is really this question of how we're going to finance the SDGs. And again, there are going to have to be resource transfers, but I also think we're going to have to think a lot about how resources and value is captured at the national level. We're going to have to think about tax reform at the national level in countries where there's an emergent middle class and they can be taxed, and where dependence on aid is actually maybe in some sense made governments less reluctant to actually engage in tax reform at the national level. And then there's this whole question of global tax reform. In other words, the whole discussion that comes out of the Panama Papers and all the discussion going on about beneficial ownership and false invoicing and all of that. That even the OECD has got a base erosion and profit shifting initiative, which has put out 15 recommendations for tax reform on a global level. That's a big political project, but I think we ought to embrace it and we ought to be tackling it. And we're hearing about it in the UK about Google, and we're hearing about all sorts of different corporations, but I think we're just hearing the tip of the iceberg. And I think we're going to see more Panama Paper releases in the coming years that are going to give political momentum to this. So those are the big salient political processes. On the rights-based question, which I think flows to some degree naturally from this, maybe what I want to say about that is, for us, the rights-based approach was not just simply having Oxfam go and think about, going to the ramparts with governments on every issue to sort of wave the human rights flag. The space to do that is tricky, and as you said, it's politically sensitive. So we do this in Vietnam, we do it in really tricky places, but we're not using the rights-based, we're not challenging every issue with a rights kind of narrative. What the rights-based approach has done for us, it's created a mind shift in the way we think about development. Basically, it's helped us think more systemically, not about, the needs-based approach is about symptoms more than it is about root causes. If you want to think about root causes, think about why people are poor. Think hard about that. And then and that forces you to look at the barriers that exclude people. And that's the mind shift that we've gone through. So every place we work, that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at, did they get a clinic built? Is the teacher there in the school? These are all symptoms of a larger problem in most of these societies, that if you're thinking from a rights-based approach and you assume that there's a duty bearer in that country and it's generally the state that's going to provide those goods at scale, we're talking about the SDGs is about sustainability at scale if we're going to be successful. And in some ways, that leads you back to systems that provide those goods at scale and what's preventing them from being achieved at scale, whether it's finance or whether it's poor functioning government systems or what have you. So I'd invite you all to kind of think about this rights approach from more of as a mind shift in the way you think about the definition of poverty and as social exclusion as opposed to the absence of public goods, and think about how it might change the way you look at things if you're looking at barriers as opposed to a public goods as your end game. And then maybe just on a couple of the questions that the panelists asked, on the question of in Burkina and in Ghana, was it national versus local actors? Well, that's a really good case. Those cases are really interesting because there's a whole nother network that's come into being out there on extractive industries that's spreading all over the world, in which there's actually social movements at the national level that are challenging their governments on, wait a minute, we're exporting all of this value all over the world through the minerals that we're exporting. What is it doing for us? And for many of the countries in Africa, this is the biggest sort of portion of their GNP. And they can't see it. It's not transparent, and much of it's going offshore. And in the worst of cases, with corruption, large volumes of it are going offshore. and citizens aren't achieving, you know, any kind of benefit from this. So these new groups are coming in, looking at the revenue side of this. They're looking at the performance of global mining companies in the country. They're looking at the tax and royalty systems that are in place and whether they should be renegotiated. Bolivia renegotiated its royalties with its extractive industries, and it's sitting on the largest surplus of funds it's ever had in its history, and is now funding public services. Well, that's the kind of thing we need to see happen in other countries. So did this happen through exclusively local action? No, because basically what you need to some degree for this kind of sophisticated work, where you're tracking down royalty taxation issues, you need both social movements at the mine site level that have a grievance, and you need sophisticated groups with technical competencies to actually link up and challenge parliamentarians and challenge the mining companies, and maybe even link into global movements on these same issues to actually pressure companies at the global level. So these linkages between the local, the national, and the global are actually enabling this kind of public advocacy in the 21st century to be even more sophisticated, and the transparency tools we have now globally enable the local actors to connect with the global actors and be even more effective in effectuating change. So it's a both and, I think, is maybe the answer to that question. In terms of data for government, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I didn't say was a lot of the success in these particular cases, all of these particular cases, ends up being both, starts with an outsider strategy where it's about data, it's about pressure, it's about a grievance, and it's about a proposition. At the end of the day, it's about getting inside, getting to the table, getting the people to the table who never get to the table to negotiate. But then when you get to the table to negotiate, one of the things we've learned over the years is you damn well better have a proposition when you get to the table, or you're going to be out of business rather quickly. So a lot of this is about taking the data to those negotiations and being as sharp and as focused and as propositional as your opposition, and being persuasive. And oftentimes what happens is you find that governments are not monolithic and parliaments aren't monolithic, and there are actually oftentimes allies you can find in those parliaments who are actually interested in the reform agenda, the way some of the candidates you illustrated are, and those are the people you want to seek out and become change agents using your data inside the system. So that's definitely, there's definitely use for data inside the system. I think maybe the most important point about data I want to make is we've got to make the data politically relevant. That's the key thing about data. And let me give you an example of that. Here in the US, Oxfam works on minimum wage issues. And one of the things we did on the minimum wage issue, we were making the argument that, you know, we have a lot of people who are working 3 jobs and they're making sub-poverty wages. And we basically did a study in the United States by congressional district of how many families were in their district and voters in their district that actually would benefit from an increase in minimum wage. And if actually that legislator supported that, they might actually win a vote. And then we took that all over Capitol Hill and said, well, look, you have 68,000 people in your district who would benefit from a $10 minimum wage. Don't you think that's an interesting proposition for you to embrace, irrespective of your party? That's where you're disaggregating data, you're making it politically relevant, and then you're taking it to the legislator and saying, you know, this has got may have some value for you. Think about it. Now you're not going to
also take it to the citizens and put it on media.
Yeah, absolutely. No, in other words, the idea is once you disaggregate it like that, we did similar kinds of things on. There's a website called Measuring America, which actually looks at, it's the first time the Human Development Index was ever done in an industrialized country here in the United States, and Oxfam funded that. And then we did studies at the county level in Mississippi, Louisiana, California, a variety of other states where literally you could challenge county officials. And then we were giving that to activist groups in those particular locales, disaggregated data to say, why is it that 3 counties over, they've got the best schools, the best clinics, health services, and we have none of those kinds of things. And then you can begin to look at who's being excluded and why. And in Mississippi, you can imagine what that might look like. Maybe just a final point here on this non-political actors and work on scorecards and so forth. I actually think that's really important work, and many of us have actually supported it. I don't think it's non-political. I think it's very political. If you're challenging a government agency on performance, or you're challenging a legislator at the subnational level who's dependent on kind of a good public image, you know, I think they become political tools. I do think they're important, and I think as we think about delivering these SDGs at subnational levels, I think we're going to have to think about tools like that, and encouraging the creation of of local institutions that can actually manage that kind of data, data organization and data delivery. Thanks.
Tadaj, Katrina, you wanna come in?
On that last point, I would say, I guess, and sort of what arises from Stuti's book is it really depends on whether these local officials are elected or not, if they're politicians or if they're just hired frontline service providers. So I think that's, there's
That's the point you're making, yeah.
that, important distinction. But, great points and good examples about taking data to negotiations with the government and providing data to government. I've got a research proposal I'm working on right now with Jessica Gottlieb, and basically we're trying to contrast the impacts of providing information to citizens versus providing information to government, and working with the government to actually try and instigate interjurisdictional competition over funds by changing funding formulas based on relative performance, and sort of horse race these two methods to sort of see, because there's more costs involved with providing information to citizens, educating them about what that information means so that they can use it, whereas when you provide it to government, it's quicker and it's less costly, but what is the relative effectiveness of each? So I think it's really important to look at this issue. I'm hoping to do some work on that.
Tadaj, do you want
Extremely briefly, so we get also a chance to hear from others. I think we should be sometimes cautious, kind of along the lines of what you're saying, about drawing this sharp line between so-called social accountability exercises on the one hand and political on the other. I think certain types of initiatives can really be blurry and cross these two. I mean, some work I'm doing now, it's still very in process, data hasn't been yet collected, looks on the one hand like social accountability kind of initiative, in that they're essentially town hall meetings in Uganda in which citizens are confronting, if you will, public service providers, but also political leaders who are also present. And there's also presence of national leaders who are underlying this initiative. So there's a lot of things that could be happening there. There could also be sort of, I'm thinking about your three triangles. We could end up being in a situation, we don't know yet what the results are, but we could be in a situation like the last triangle, where essentially this kind of initiative is used by the national government for citizens to be like secondary agents to the principles of the central government, in order to provide information on what local governments are doing. So it could go in various different directions, but just to say that I think sometimes these lines can be quite blurry.
I want to take one more round of questions, and I'm afraid both questions and answers are going to have to be brief now. Suresh, James, and Mark, and so we've got 4 questions I can take. Suresh?
Suresh Babu, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI. Quick information on the policy process research that's been happening at IFPRI. There is, we have started to work on what are the drivers of policy change at the national level as well as at the local level. And if you, again, Google it, drivers of policy change, you will have a conceptual framework and some case studies in IFPRI website. That will be useful because most of the issues that we discuss are related to that, what happens at that level. Clarification question, data. What is the real data that we are talking about? At IFPRI, we have been working on strengthening data systems for the past 25 years in many countries, the statistical systems, and we keep telling the governments, invest more in data collection. The governments resist because most of the data is collected and not used, and the data that is used is not effectively used in the policy space because there is no capacity to analyze the data at the country level. And most of this studies, if you see, it's from external actors and players coming in, collecting that data, whether it's LSMS or the national level data, publishing in international journals. So very little data analyzed at the civil society level, or so that's the political data space you talked about. So that has to be defined. Otherwise, we'll keep saying invest more in data collection, and they will resist that. The third point I want to make is on.
I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll not make the third point.
So, yeah. Yeah.
You're advocating for, sorry, I'm James Thurlow from IFPRI. You're advocating for political freedoms and engagement, and let me ask a question you must hear all the time, because it would be great to hear how you respond to it, and that is that if we look at Africa, some of the most successful developing countries in Africa are countries like Ethiopia and Rwanda, who have tenuous democracies at best. And so How do you respond to the idea that a development-minded state can substitute for democratic freedoms and engagement? And how do you think about economic freedoms perhaps being of greater priority early on in the development process instead of political freedoms, and sort of how does that weight change as countries develop going forward? Otherwise, we end up sounding like we have a Washington consensus on political development here.
Okay.
Oh. Wow, James. Mark Cohen from Oxfam, and many, many moons ago also I worked here at IFPRI. I think the one theme I heard across everybody today is citizenship, engaging citizens, and our rights-based perspective at Oxfam is about active citizens and effective states. But we're living in an era where migration, whether it's forcible or voluntary, is a huge segment of the population. So how does that factor into all the questions we've been talking about?
Very good question. Okay. Yes. Please introduce.
Thank you very much. I'm involved with UNESCO in what is called intangible cultural heritage, and for the last 18 years. And our purpose is to include the best practices of how local area functions. Unfortunately, I don't have experience only in Scandinavia mostly and in Japan. So if we accept that sustainable development goals, it's a radical change. It's 15 years is very short. My challenge today is how to bring it at local level in the following way. I will give you an example. In Scandinavia, for instance, and in Japan, in the local areas, especially rural areas, where we started with the local cultural identity, with very specific cultural heritage, which helped them brand their strategy, the local area was motivated to be informed, and in one case they set up a new political party. For instance, in Norway it's a case, in very remote rural area. So how to have an informed process locally, empower it, and then reflect it in political decision and political institutions. So empower local initiative. In that respect, if I may add the following thing, as soon as we documented them, they had the courage to go to UNESCO, to the World Bank, to European Commission, and we conducted the project. So inform local area, which, and my last comment is, what I would call relevant cross-cutting themes. For instance, 30% of the land is degraded. Fertilizer, it's almost a tragedy in Africa. Why not to combine in the relevant areas critical cross-cutting themes like land degradation, so restoration, fertilizer, especially for rural area.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me put in one not easy question, and you can then choose which of these things you can engage with now. But to bring it back to the SDGs, what does this tell us about the SDG indicators, and especially the trade-offs between finding SDG indicators that are using readily available data with things that are in the SDGs that are much more challenging? The underlying concepts, I think, sometimes go beyond that, what are already being collected. So let me put that back to you, and maybe Ray, then Stuti, and then Katrina and Theodosh, very briefly.
Well, maybe a couple of comments on SDGs. First of all, somebody last week, commented in a way that I thought was interesting, where they were trying to be realistic about what are we going to get done by 2030 on this 17-goal SDG body of work. And basically said, we really need to look at this as the master plan for development for the 21st century and take, to some degree, a longer view and set an ambition for 2030, work hard to get there, and then see where we are. But let's be realistic. So I actually find that a helpful way to look at it. I think we're going to be, what I like about the SDG framework, it's universal, it's meant to be delivering at the national level, it's comprehensive, so there's a lot there we can work with, and the question is, how do we do that? The other thing I think that we're discovering as we actually are looking at implementation is that governments and business are not assuming they can implement all of these goals. What governments are doing is they have their strategic plans. Even even the Ethiopian government that hosted the financing meetings early on, they have a very ambitious strategic plan, but they're determining we're going to do 6 goals or 7 goals. And most governments are actually, that's what they're doing. They're picking out what's most relevant and important for my national context for impact and figuring out what that is going to be. So if you're talking to ministers in these countries, you're probably, your first question is, well, which of these goals have you decided are priority within your plan? And then they're linking them to their plan ex post facto and then figuring out how they're going to monitor them and collect the data. Actually, companies are doing the same thing. Companies are developing business plans, and then they're incorporating the SDG delivery into their business plans, and then actually trying to figure out how they're going to make explicit contributions through their supply chains to the particular SDGs they care about. So we're getting sort of partial contributions made from different institutional actors. In terms of the in terms of this question of can we, how do we advance locally? I mean, I think at the end of the day, there is a lot of work that's going to have to be done at the subnational level, and I think that's a whole other conversation that we need to be talking about. And I think really, to some degree, a lot of the problem we're going to have there is going to be an institutional capacity problem, because we're working in Peru, for example, and Peru's actually passed some interesting decentralization legislation in the past number of years, and they have enormous amounts of cash in the capital that they're now starting to decentralize to the provinces. Problem at the provincial level is the institutional capacity to actually utilize that money well and also be accountable for it is weak. So therefore, there's a case where you actually have the resources, but you don't have the capacity. And so the project then, in a Peruvian case, where it's a middle-income emergent economy, is again entering a phase where they're building that institutional capacity to be able to deliver on SDGs at a local level in a meaningful way. In the cases you're talking about that are more culturally specific, I do think there's real value in investing in the dignity of people and strengthening identity to enable them to exercise voice. And at the end of the day, when we talk about citizenship, and particularly of minorities, it's enabling people to exercise voice in a diverse national context. And I think that's obviously what UNESCO is devoted to, and I think there's an important role for you to play in that domain.
Ruthie, I realize you won't be able to answer all of the questions in the time, but...
Let me begin with the most sensitive question that James raised. I don't think we are advocating for political freedoms, and I didn't have time to go into those nuances, but the report spends several pages describing the Ethiopias and the Rwandas and the Chinas of the world, and we claim that our framework explains those cases as well. It's just a different form of political engagement. So in more autocratic regimes, the selection and sanctioning of the power to select and sanction leaders is more structured within an organized elite, and we discuss the literature on that and how to think about the restricted forms of political engagement. But we also confront this question of you have a Kenya on the one hand and an Ethiopia on the other hand, and our argument is, firstly, you cannot choose whether you cannot choose your good dictators. So that is a problem. And once you are lucky to, say, have a good dictator, you cannot transplant that lesson to a place where you don't have one. So Kenya cannot become Ethiopia. The way out for Kenya is through its messy democratic processes. And that's what we mean by when politics is a problem, you can't just bypass it, you have to go through it. As Robert Frost said, to be a little bit poetic, the best way out is always through. On the question of citizenship and how we live in a world with non-citizens, number of non-citizens increasing, I don't think the report is, it's within the scope of the report to directly answer that question, but I do believe we have implications for how do you build institutions to prevent conflict. So in fragile contexts, pre-conflict, how do you build institutions so that they don't get into a conflict situation? And so everything about institutional building, legitimacy, trust in the state, these themes are very much part of that of that story. And I think generally on the migration issue, the more countries are able to provide services and economic opportunities for their own people, the issue of migration is also likely to go down in importance. And I'll leave the question on the data for another, because I have a very involved answer to that. I did want to say one thing in response to what Katrina was talking about, a horse race between, do you do it from the top or do you do it through the citizens? Ben Olken had a very interesting paper that the social accountability people in the bank were just appalled by, because he showed in Indonesia that top-down audits are more effective at controlling local corruption than giving information to communities and citizens and having them address the corruption problem. And I think, again, the framework in the report is, that's a false dichotomy. You, of course, need top-down, all kinds of internal institutions of government to function better. The problem is when they don't. How do you get there? So, again, there's no way of bypassing the political process which impacts incentives and behavior for everybody from the local up to the national chain. So I don't think it's a dichotomy or a horse race as much as a way of thinking about the problem.
Okay.
I think I'll use my time given.
Okay. Let me thank our speakers and discussants, and join me in thank you all for attending, and look forward to further conversations on this.